The front doors of Blackwood Manor stood open when 8-year-old Arthur appeared at the top of the staircase and saw his mother's trunks being carried into the night. He froze. Below him, servants lined the entrance hall in dreadful silence, while Lady Eleanor Ashcombe stood before her husband without a cloak, without her wedding ring, and apparently without a place in the home where she had spent the last 9 years of her life. Lord Sebastian had already made his decision. By midnight, Eleanor was to leave Blackwood Manor alone. Arthur would remain behind. The boy rushed down the stairs, calling for his mother, but Sebastian caught him before he could reach her. Arthur struggled against his father's arms, unable to understand why the man who had once promised to protect them both was now ordering his mother from their home like a disgraced servant. Eleanor's face finally broke, not when her husband accused her of interfering with the estate accounts, not when the Dowager Duchess watched from the staircase with cold satisfaction, not even when Lady Vivian stood nearby, silent and perfectly composed. It was Arthur's frightened voice that nearly destroyed her. Eleanor crossed the hall, knelt before her son, and promised she would come back for him. That was when the Dowager Duchess gave a small, merciless laugh. Eleanor should not make promises inside a house that no longer belonged to her, she said. For several seconds, Eleanor said nothing. Then something changed in her expression. The hurt remained, but beneath it appeared a calm Sebastian had never seen before. She slowly rose. Her eyes moved from the Duchess to her husband, and then Eleanor said the one sentence that turned the entire room silent. Perhaps, she told them, it was finally time they discovered who Blackwood Manor truly belonged to. 3 weeks earlier, no one at Blackwood Manor would have imagined that Eleanor Ashcombe would soon be standing at its doors with her trunks packed. For 9 years, she had lived beneath that roof as Sebastian's wife, yet there were still members of his family who looked at her as though she had never truly belonged there. The problem had begun long before the marriage. Eleanor had no grand title attached to her name, no famous ancestry that impressed drawing rooms, no powerful uncle seated in Parliament. To Beatrice Ashcombe, that had always been enough to make her unsuitable. But Eleanor had never tried to prove her worth with pedigree. She proved it quietly. She oversaw the household charities when others forgot them. She remembered which tenant families had sick children, which servants had elderly parents, which widows needed coal before winter. When Blackwood went through difficult seasons, she reduced household expenses without embarrassing anyone, and found ways to keep servants employed. And through all of it, Arthur remained the center of her world. The boy followed her everywhere when he was small. Even at 8, he still sought her out, whenever he was frightened, confused, or simply needed someone who listened before judging. Sebastian had once loved that about her. There had been a time when he laughed more easily, when he would return from riding and find Eleanor in the library, then stay there far longer than necessary just to talk. But after his father died, something changed. Sebastian was no longer simply the heir. He was preparing to take his place as Duke of Blackwood, and every decision suddenly seemed to carry the weight of generations. Beatrice made certain he felt that weight. She reminded him constantly that a duke needed influence, connections, alliances, things, she often implied, Eleanor had failed to bring him. Then Lady Vivian Harcourt returned to Blackwood. Recently widowed, wealthy, impeccably connected, and born into one of the oldest noble families in the county, Vivian seemed to embody everything Beatrice wished Eleanor had been. At first, Eleanor dismissed the comparisons. Then Sebastian began closing doors when she entered rooms. Letters disappeared from his desk. Conversations stopped when she approached. And something else troubled her even more. The estate accounts were changing. Large sums had vanished without explanation. Several tenants had suddenly been charged higher rents. Repairs Sebastian claimed were completed had never been carried out. When Eleanor questioned him, he brushed her concerns aside. Beatrice was colder. Financial matters, she informed Eleanor, belonged to men who understood them. Eleanor said nothing, because there was one thing no one at Blackwood understood. She knew those accounts better than any of them suspected, and what she saw frightened her. Blackwood was not merely struggling, it was sliding toward ruin. That night, long after the household had gone quiet, Eleanor entered the small sitting room adjoining her chambers and locked the door behind her. Then she crossed to an old writing desk no servant was permitted to touch. From beneath her sleeve, she removed a tiny key. The lock clicked. Inside lay a bundle of documents tied with faded ribbon, and pressed into the wax on the topmost page was a seal that had not been used in 20 years. Her grandfather's. The documents should have remained hidden. That had always been Eleanor's intention, but secrets had a way of becoming dangerous when other people sensed they existed. Over the following days, Vivienne began asking questions of her own, never enough to appear intrusive, never with the cruelty Beatrice displayed so openly. Her concern always sounded almost reasonable. She mentioned to Sebastian that Eleanor had been speaking with servants about household expenses. She wondered aloud why Eleanor seemed suddenly interested in ledgers that had never concerned her before. Beatrice needed very little encouragement. With Sebastian's investiture approaching, she warned him that even the appearance of financial disorder could humiliate the family before half the county. If Eleanor was searching for something, Beatrice insisted, Sebastian had a right to know what it was. Then £1,200 disappeared from one of Blackwood's household accounts. The withdrawal had been authorized in writing, and beneath the amount was Eleanor's signature. Sebastian brought the document to her himself. Eleanor examined it once and immediately denied signing it, but the imitation was almost perfect. Sebastian stared at her as though waiting for another explanation. There was none she could give. To believe Eleanor, he would have to believe someone inside Blackwood Manor had deliberately forged his wife's name, and Sebastian was not yet prepared to accept that betrayal could exist so close to him. The distance between them widened. Arthur noticed before anyone realized he was watching. One afternoon, while searching for a wooden soldier he had misplaced, he heard voices behind the drawing room doors. His grandmother was speaking to Vivienne. Arthur understood very little of the conversation, but he understood one sentence. Once Eleanor was gone, Beatrice said, Sebastian would eventually understand what had to happen. That evening, Arthur repeated those words to his mother. Eleanor did not frighten him by showing what she felt. She kissed his forehead, told him he had done nothing wrong, and sent him back to his lessons. Only after he left did the fear settle across her face. The next morning, a private letter arrived. It came from Elias Pembroke, the elderly solicitor who had managed her grandfather's affairs. Eleanor met him away from the manor. Pembroke wasted no time. The period established in her grandfather's settlement was approaching its end, and circumstances surrounding Blackwood had changed more quickly than either of them expected. He urged Eleanor to tell Sebastian the truth. She refused. For 9 years, Sebastian had believed he married a woman who brought him little beyond herself. Eleanor had needed it that way. She had wanted to know that when Sebastian reached for her hand, he was choosing Eleanor, not property, money, or influence hidden behind her name. Pembroke regarded her sadly. Silence might once have protected that certainty. Now, he warned, it could cost her far more. By the time Eleanor returned to Blackwood, Sebastian already knew she had met him. Beatrice transformed the meeting into something sinister before Eleanor had even removed her gloves. A secret solicitor, missing money, private questions about the estate. By dinner, the accusation had spread around the table without anyone needing to speak it plainly. Sebastian finally demanded an answer in front of them all. What business did Eleanor have discussing Blackwood with a solicitor behind his back? Eleanor looked from Beatrice to Vivienne, then finally at her husband. She could have ended the suspicion that moment. Instead, she remained silent, and Sebastian mistook silence for guilt. His voice hardened. If Eleanor was hiding anything concerning Blackwood, she had 24 hours to tell him everything. Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment. Then, quietly, she gave him the only answer she could. He would not believe her, even if she did. Eleanor did not wait for Sebastian's 24 hours to expire. By morning, she was already searching for the truth herself. She began with the missing £1,200, quietly tracing the household ledgers and comparing dates against letters, receipts, and bank notices no one else thought important. What she found only deepened the mystery. The money had been transferred shortly before Vivienne returned to Blackwood. For a moment, Eleanor suspected the obvious, but the payment had never gone to Vivienne. Instead, it passed through several accounts before Eleanor recognized a name connected to each of them: Beatrice. That afternoon, Eleanor entered the Dowager Duchess's private sitting room and closed the door behind her. Beatrice denied nothing. She admitted moving money between accounts, but not because she intended to steal from Blackwood. She had been trying to save it. Then, for the first time, Eleanor heard the truth Sebastian himself did not know. Blackwood Manor was drowning in debt. Sebastian's late father had borrowed enormous sums over many years and concealed the extent of them from his son. Loans had been renewed, interest postponed, properties pledged, and obligations shifted from one account to another until the Ashcombe fortune looked far stronger than it truly was. Beatrice had spent years keeping creditors quiet. Now Sebastian's formal inheritance of the dukedom was approaching, and with it would come scrutiny of accounts she could no longer hide. Eleanor understood immediately why Vivienne had suddenly become so welcome at Blackwood. Vivienne possessed something Beatrice desperately needed: money. Enough money, perhaps, to save the estate. Eleanor looked at the woman who had judged her for 9 years and asked the question Beatrice had avoided answering. What happened to Sebastian's wife in this carefully imagined future? Beatrice's expression barely changed. Marriages between important families had ended for far less, she reminded her. The words struck Eleanor harder than she expected, but when Eleanor accused her of forging the withdrawal authorization, Beatrice's composure cracked. She had moved money. Yes, she had hidden debts, but she had never forged Eleanor's name. If Beatrice was telling the truth, someone else had created the evidence, and that meant the danger inside Blackwood was larger than either woman understood. Eleanor hurried back to her rooms. The moment she entered, she knew someone had been there. A drawer stood slightly open. Books had been returned to the wrong shelves. Then she reached the old writing desk. The lock had been forced. The bundle bearing her grandfather's seal was gone. Arthur found her staring into the empty compartment. After some hesitation, he told her that earlier he had seen Lady Vivienne leaving that corridor. Eleanor went to Vivienne immediately. This time, there were no polite smiles. Vivienne listened to the accusation, then firmly denied entering Eleanor's room or taking any documents. But she did reveal something Eleanor had not expected. Sebastian and Beatrice had already discussed the possibility of ending his marriage. Not yesterday, not after the missing money. before any accusation against Eleanor had appeared. The knowledge hollowed something inside her. Whatever Sebastian now believed she had done, he had begun imagining a life without her before he had evidence to justify it. That evening, the final blow came. Sebastian received copies of letters supposedly sent by Eleanor to Blackwood's creditors. They suggested she had been asking what would happen if the estate defaulted. Sebastian confronted her again. This time, Eleanor saw the pattern clearly: the missing money, the forged signature, the stolen documents, the letters. Someone was not merely trying to make her look dishonest. Someone wanted Sebastian convinced that his own wife intended to seize Blackwood from him. For one dangerous moment, Eleanor almost told him everything. She almost revealed the truth she had guarded throughout their marriage. Then Sebastian looked at her with anger and said something that changed the way she saw him. Perhaps her family had planned this from the beginning. Perhaps they had married Eleanor into Blackwood because they had always wanted Ashcombe wealth. Eleanor became completely still, because if Sebastian knew the truth, he would understand how cruelly wrong he was. Her family had never needed Ashcombe wealth. Blackwood had needed theirs. Before Eleanor could answer, the doors opened. Elias Pembroke had arrived at the manor without invitation. He asked to speak with Eleanor immediately. Across the room, Beatrice saw the solicitor, and for the first time since Eleanor had known her, the Dowager Duchess looked genuinely afraid. Pembroke's arrival changed the atmosphere inside Blackwood almost immediately. Sebastian received him in the library, with Eleanor present and Beatrice refusing to leave. The old solicitor remained courteous, but there was nothing uncertain in his manner. He told Sebastian only one thing, with complete clarity. If Eleanor were removed from Blackwood Manor without careful consideration, the consequences could extend far beyond a broken marriage. Sebastian heard only the warning. To him, it sounded like a threat. He demanded to know what legal claim Eleanor believed she possessed over his family's estate. Pembroke glanced toward Eleanor. She gave the smallest shake of her head. He could say no more. Beatrice seized upon the silence. She told Sebastian that no outsider had the right to frighten him inside his own home. Least of all, a solicitor acting for a wife who refused to explain herself. Sebastian agreed, and Eleanor understood that every attempt to protect the truth was now being used against her. The fracture in the household soon reached Arthur. At dinner the following evening, the boy refused to sit beside Vivienne. When Sebastian corrected him, Arthur pushed his chair back and asked the question everyone else had been too polite to ask. Why was everyone trying to replace his mother? The room fell silent. Vivienne looked genuinely uncomfortable. Beatrice dismissed the boy's words as childishness, but Arthur did not stop. He wanted to know why his grandmother constantly invited Vivienne to sit beside Sebastian, why his mother cried when she thought no one was watching, why people kept whispering about sending her away. Sebastian ordered him upstairs. Arthur obeyed, but not before looking at his father with an expression Sebastian had never seen from his son before: disappointment. 2 days later, the private disaster became public. Blackwood was hosting several neighboring nobles for an afternoon gathering when an unfamiliar carriage arrived at the front steps. The man who entered was not a guest. He was a creditor, and he was not interested in discretion. Before servants could remove him, he demanded payment on an overdue obligation tied to the Blackwood estate. Conversations stopped across the drawing room. Sebastian stood motionless, while men who had congratulated him on his coming title suddenly avoided his eyes. For a family built on reputation, it was humiliation of the worst kind. By evening, everyone seemed to believe Eleanor had caused it. she had questioned the accounts. She had met a solicitor secretly. She had supposedly contacted creditors. Now one had arrived before half the county. Sebastian's embarrassment became fury. He confronted Eleanor after the guests were gone. She tried to make him understand that exposing Blackwood's debts would make no sense. Arthur would inherit whatever remained of the Ashcombe legacy. Why would she deliberately destroy the future of her own child? Sebastian asked why she cared so deeply about an estate that had never belonged to her. For one brief second, Eleanor almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the irony was becoming unbearable. She could have answered him with a single sentence. Instead, she swallowed it. Later that night, Arthur crept into her room, holding a folded piece of paper. He had found it beneath a cabinet in Beatrice's sitting room. He could not read the legal language, but he recognized the seal impressed near the bottom. It was the same seal he had once seen on papers inside Eleanor's locked desk, her grandfather's. Eleanor took the document carefully. It was one of the missing pages, but finding it in Beatrice's rooms did not prove what she first thought. The cabinet had been moved. One drawer had been forced. Someone had searched Beatrice's sitting room too. For the first time, Eleanor considered the possibility that Beatrice was not the only person being manipulated. The following afternoon, Vivian asked to speak with her privately. This time, there was no polished smile between them. Vivian admitted that Beatrice had encouraged her to think about Sebastian as more than an old friend, not immediately, not openly, but eventually, if Eleanor were no longer part of the family. Vivian insisted she had never forged a signature, stolen documents, or contacted creditors. Then, she produced something of her own. Anonymous letters. They had begun arriving shortly after she returned to Blackwood. Each promised, in increasingly confident language, that Eleanor would not remain at the manor much longer. One message had even suggested Vivian prepare herself for a new place within the Ashcombe family. Eleanor read the letters twice. The pattern finally became impossible to ignore. Someone had wanted Beatrice to distrust her. Someone had wanted Sebastian to suspect her. Someone had wanted Vivian waiting nearby as the convenient replacement. And someone wanted Eleanor frightened enough to leave. Before she could decide who benefited most, hoofbeats sounded outside. A messenger had arrived from London. Sebastian opened the sealed notice in the hall. His expression changed as he read. Blackwood had only days to settle a major outstanding obligation. If it failed, legal possession of the property could change hands. Sebastian stared at the page, as though the words themselves were impossible. He had no idea who controlled the debt, capable of taking Blackwood away from him. Across the hall, Eleanor already knew, and for the first time, she began to wonder how much longer she could afford to keep silent. Eleanor did not wait for another accusation. Before dawn the next morning, she left Blackwood through the eastern gate and met Elias Pembroke on a quiet road beyond the estate grounds. For years, Pembroke had protected a truth almost no one in the Ashcombe family understood. Eleanor's maternal grandfather had never possessed a noble title. To Beatrice, that had always made him insignificant. But titles had never measured his fortune. He had built his wealth through shipping, land, banking, and investments that stretched far beyond the county. By the time Eleanor was born, his name carried more financial weight in London than many ancient families would ever admit. And decades earlier, Blackwood had needed him desperately. Sebastian's grandfather had nearly lost everything: bad investments, reckless borrowing, and years of maintaining appearances had pushed the estate toward ruin. Banks refused further loans. Creditors were preparing to seize portions of the land. Eleanor's grandfather stepped in, quietly. No public scandal, no auction, no humiliation. He paid the most dangerous obligations and took control of the mortgage attached to Blackwood, along with several surrounding properties used as security. The Ashcombes remained in residence. Society never knew how close they had come to losing the estate. Years later, those financial interests passed to Eleanor's mother, and after her mother died, they passed to Eleanor. That was the truth Beatrice had never bothered to discover about the supposedly insignificant woman her son had married. Eleanor had controlled Blackwood's most dangerous debt for years. She could have demanded repayment. She could have refused extensions. She could have allowed creditors to descend upon the estate and strip the Ashcombe family of everything they were desperate to preserve. She had done none of it. Whenever payments were late, Eleanor instructed Pembroke to grant more time. When interest threatened to become unbearable, she quietly reduced it. When Sebastian's father needed another extension, she approved it without allowing her name to appear. Not because the Ashcombes had earned her mercy, because Sebastian was her husband, and because one day Blackwood was meant to become Arthur's home. Pembroke had repeatedly urged her to tell Sebastian. Eleanor always refused. She had spent too many years watching marriages between noble families become contracts disguised as affection. She wanted one thing in her own marriage that could not be purchased: certainty. She wanted to know Sebastian had chosen her because he loved Eleanor, not because she controlled the debt hanging over his ancestral home. Now that decision had become almost unbearable. For 9 years, the woman Beatrice treated as a burden had been quietly protecting Blackwood, and the husband, who believed she wanted his wealth, had been living beneath the protection of hers. But Pembroke had not summoned Eleanor merely to revisit the past. He handed her another document. Someone had attempted to purchase the controlling Blackwood obligation from the trust managing her inheritance. The request carried legal authorization that appeared to come from Eleanor herself. It was fraudulent. Eleanor's attention sharpened immediately. If the transaction had succeeded, control of the debt would have passed to someone else. That person could then refuse further extensions. They could force repayment. And if Blackwood failed to meet the obligation, they could begin proceedings against the estate. Eleanor looked back toward the distant outline of the manor, the forged signature, the stolen documents, the letters sent to Vivian, the creditor arriving during the gathering, even the pressure to remove Eleanor from Blackwood. None of it was simply about destroying her marriage. Someone needed her isolated, discredited, and preferably gone before the legal deadline arrived. The realization changed everything. Back at the manor, Sebastian found Arthur sitting on the floor of his bedroom beside a small traveling case. Inside were 2 shirts, a wool coat, 3 books, and the wooden horse Eleanor had given him years earlier. Sebastian stared at the case. Arthur was leaving, or at least, he believed he was. When Sebastian asked where he intended to go, Arthur gave him an answer far too serious for an 8-year-old boy. He would go wherever his mother went. Sebastian reminded him that Blackwood was his home. Arthur looked at him and said quietly that if his mother was not Blackwood enough to live there, then neither was he. The words struck Sebastian harder than any accusation Eleanor had made. For a moment, he saw what the household had become through his son's eyes. A place where whispers followed his mother, where another woman sat too often beside his father, where adults discussed sending Eleanor away, as though Arthur was supposed to remain untouched by it. Sebastian almost reconsidered. Almost. Then pride intervened. The estate was in danger. His family name had become gossip. His marriage was collapsing, and every unanswered question still seemed to lead back to Eleanor. He convinced himself that ending the uncertainty was the only way to restore order. By evening, he had decided Eleanor would leave Blackwood. Meanwhile, in London, Pembroke continued tracing the fraudulent attempt to acquire the debt. The purchaser had hidden behind intermediaries, false instructions, and borrowed accounts. But one signature had been overlooked. One family connection had been used where the conspirator assumed no one would notice. Pembroke stared at the name for a long time. Then he sent word to Eleanor immediately. Whoever was trying to take Blackwood from beneath them was not an outsider. The request led back to someone carrying the Ashcombe name. For several hours, Eleanor believed Beatrice had finally been cornered. The trail seemed to point toward her. Hidden debts, moved money, quiet meetings, years of protecting Blackwood's reputation at any cost. When Eleanor confronted her again, Beatrice did not deny the deception she had already admitted. She had hidden the extent of the family's financial collapse. She had shifted money between accounts. She had encouraged Sebastian to think about a future without Eleanor. But when Eleanor accused her of trying to purchase the debt attached to Blackwood, Beatrice's anger was immediate. She had done many things to protect the Ashcombe name, she said. That was not one of them. For once, Eleanor believed her, because the person behind the scheme needed more than access to family accounts. They needed to understand the debt itself, and very few people did. The answer came from Pembroke. One of the names attached to the fraudulent transaction belonged to a private financial agent in London. Pembroke had seen that name before. The man had recently represented Lord Reginald Ashcombe, Sebastian's cousin. Reginald had spent years appearing harmless. He laughed too loudly at dinners, borrowed money too casually, and lived with the confidence of a man who always assumed another relative would eventually rescue him. But there was something everyone had overlooked. After Sebastian and Arthur, Reginald stood dangerously close to the Blackwood succession. And after the old Duke's death, he had been given temporary access to estate papers, while Sebastian dealt with funeral arrangements and inheritance matters. That was when he had discovered the truth. Not all of it, but enough. He learned Blackwood was drowning in obligations. He discovered that an outside trust controlled the most dangerous debt, and he realized that if Sebastian could be financially destroyed while Eleanor was pushed away from the family, Blackwood might become vulnerable enough to seize. The plan was ruthless. Reginald would obtain Eleanor's controlling debt through forged authorization. Then he would refuse every extension she had quietly granted. Blackwood would default. Foreclosure would follow. And once the estate collapsed in disgrace, Reginald intended to use his Ashcombe name, family influence, and private backers to acquire it for a fraction of its true value. Eleanor understood something else immediately. Reginald did not need to destroy her reputation forever. He only needed Sebastian to distrust her long enough, and by then, he had nearly succeeded. But Reginald also realized Eleanor was getting too close, so he moved first. That evening, Sebastian received another packet of documents. Inside were copies of letters supposedly exchanged between Eleanor and Pembroke. They suggested that the two of them intended to take control of Blackwood immediately after Sebastian formally became Duke. The letters were forged, but by then, Sebastian had seen so many pieces of evidence pointing toward Eleanor that doubt had hardened into certainty. He confronted her in the entrance hall, not privately, before Beatrice, before Vivian, before servants who had begun pretending not to hear the arguments that now filled the house. Sebastian demanded the truth. He wanted to know why Pembroke controlled papers connected to Blackwood, why Eleanor had hidden her family's involvement, why her name appeared beside debts he had never known existed. Eleanor could have ended it. She could have explained everything. But doing so before an audience, under accusation, would have turned 9 years of private sacrifice into a spectacle. She refused. Instead, she asked Sebastian one question. Why did every person who wanted to ruin him first need to make him distrust his wife? For a moment, he had no answer. Beatrice did. She told Sebastian not to allow Eleanor to confuse him again. If Eleanor truly possessed nothing to hide, she would have spoken long ago. Vivienne surprised everyone. She stepped forward and told Sebastian he was making a mistake. For the first time, she openly defended Eleanor. The forged letters were too convenient, she argued, too perfectly timed. If Sebastian sent Eleanor away now, he might be giving whoever created them exactly what they wanted. But humiliation had already wounded Sebastian's pride too deeply. Creditors had entered his home. Neighbors were whispering. His own son barely looked at him, and now he believed Eleanor had spent years keeping secrets about the estate he was supposed to inherit. He made his decision. Eleanor would leave Blackwood before midnight. The servants were ordered to prepare her trunks. Arthur heard every word from the staircase. Eleanor did not see him. By the time she reached her room, the first trunk had already been opened across her bed. She packed slowly, refusing to let the servants see her hands tremble. Then she noticed something on the chair beside the window. Arthur's small wool coat was gone. So were his boots. Eleanor stopped. She crossed immediately to his bedroom. The bed was empty. His traveling case had disappeared too, and somewhere inside the enormous house, no one seemed to know where the young heir had gone. Arthur had not run away from Blackwood. He had gone looking for something. The boy had spent days listening to adults speak in half-finished sentences, watching doors close when he entered rooms, and hearing his mother accused of things he did not understand. But there was one detail he remembered clearly. Several nights earlier, he had seen Lord Reginald near Beatrice's private office. At the time, he thought nothing of it. Now, with his mother preparing to leave, the memory felt important. Arthur slipped through the back corridor and entered an unused study where old ledgers and family papers had been stored after the late Duke's death. The room smelled faintly of dust and cold ash. At first, he found nothing. Then he noticed the fireplace. Someone had recently burned papers there. Arthur knelt and began sorting carefully through the remains. Most had collapsed into blackened fragments, but one envelope had survived near the edge of the grate. Part of a name remained visible. Reginald. Arthur reached for it. A voice behind him made him freeze. Lord Reginald stood in the doorway. He did not shout. That frightened Arthur more. Reginald crossed the room slowly, took the envelope from the boy's hand, and examined it, as though Arthur had merely picked up something misplaced. Then he bent slightly so their eyes were level. Children, he told Arthur calmly, often imagined themselves brave when they involved themselves in matters they did not understand. But interfering in adult affairs could cost them more than they expected. Arthur stared at him. Reginald never touched him. He did not need to. The warning was enough. Arthur ran. By the time Eleanor found him near the servants' staircase, he was pale and breathing hard. She pulled him against her and waited until he could speak. Then Arthur told her everything. The burned papers, the envelope, Reginald. The warning. Something inside Eleanor changed. For weeks, she had convinced herself that keeping silent protected Arthur. If Sebastian did not know the truth, then their marriage could still be separated from money, inheritance, and legal claims. But silence had no longer preserved anything. It had allowed someone else to control the story. And now that someone had frightened her son, for the first time, Eleanor understood that refusing to speak was no longer an act of love. It was becoming dangerous. Before she could act, Vivian came to her. She carried another memory that suddenly mattered. Months earlier, before the missing money and before the forged letters, Reginald had asked whether she would ever consider marrying Sebastian if circumstances changed. Vivian had dismissed the question as gossip. Now she understood. Reginald had not been flirting with scandal. He had been testing the future. He wanted to know whether Eleanor could be removed and another woman placed beside Sebastian without destabilizing the family entirely. Then Beatrice arrived with evidence of her own. Several financial documents carried her signature. She had signed none of them. For the first time, the three women stood in the same room without rivalry between them. Beatrice had distrusted Eleanor because she considered her socially inferior. Vivienne had allowed herself to become part of a household already fractured by suspicion. And Eleanor had hidden truths because she believed love should survive without them. Reginald had used every weakness, every prejudice, every silence. And Sebastian had been surrounded until he no longer knew whom to trust. Still, when Beatrice and Vivian tried to warn him, he resisted. Too much had happened. Too many documents bore Eleanor's name. Too many questions remained unanswered. Then Pembroke arrived, with the paper Eleanor had been waiting for. Not another account, not another letter, a deed, and with it, the final piece of Blackwood's history. Years earlier, when Sebastian's grandfather borrowed against the estate, Blackwood Manor itself had been transferred as security. It was not protected by the family entail in the way Sebastian believed. The debt had never been fully redeemed. Under the original settlement, legal ownership eventually passed to Eleanor's mother, and when Eleanor's mother died, the property passed again to Eleanor. For years, Sebastian had believed Blackwood Manor was his family's unquestioned possession. It was not. The mortgage, her grandfather's seal, the missing papers, the legal deadline, the forged signatures, the attempt to force Eleanor out, every piece finally fit. Reginald needed Eleanor separated from the estate because she was not merely connected to Blackwood's debt. She owned the house itself. Eleanor held the deed in both hands. Then Sebastian's voice carried up from the entrance hall below. He was ordering the servants to open the front doors. Eleanor was to be removed from his house before midnight. Eleanor looked down at the document, then at Arthur, and without another word, she walked toward the staircase. By the time Eleanor reached the entrance hall, the scene had become almost exactly what Sebastian had intended it to be. Her trunk stood beside the open doors. Servants gathered along the walls, trying not to stare. Rain swept across the stone steps outside, and Arthur stood halfway down the staircase, watching his parents as though he already understood that whatever happened next would change their family forever. Sebastian faced Eleanor from the center of the hall. His anger had cooled into something more controlled, but no less final. He told her she had been given every opportunity to explain herself. Instead, she had hidden documents, met solicitors in secret, and allowed Blackwood's affairs to become public scandal. As far as he was concerned, she had lost the right to remain there. Eleanor listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked one final question. Was he absolutely certain this was what he wanted? Sebastian hesitated, only briefly. Then he said yes. Eleanor lowered her eyes to the document in her hand. When she raised them again, there was no anger in her face, only certainty. She crossed the hall and placed the deed on the table between them. Sebastian barely glanced at it. Then Pembroke entered. The old solicitor removed his wet coat, approached the family, and formally identified himself as trustee of the settlement established by Eleanor's grandfather. Sebastian demanded to know what settlement had anything to do with Blackwood. Pembroke answered carefully. Decades earlier, Sebastian's grandfather had borrowed heavily to prevent the collapse of the estate. When he could no longer repay those obligations, Eleanor's grandfather stepped in, but the arrangement had not been a simple loan. Blackwood Manor itself, together with several surrounding private lands, had been transferred as security. The Ashcombe family retained residential rights. They could live there, maintain the property, present it socially as the family seat. But legal ownership had passed elsewhere until the debt was redeemed. Sebastian stared at him. His grandfather had never redeemed it. The rights later passed through the Ashcombe line, but ownership remained with Eleanor's family. When Eleanor's grandfather died, his interest passed to Eleanor's mother, and after her mother's death, it passed to Eleanor. The silence inside the hall became almost unbearable. Sebastian looked down at the deed again. This time, he read the name. Eleanor Ashcombe. Beatrice stepped forward, pale. She knew there had once been an arrangement, but Sebastian's father had assured her years ago that the matter was settled. Pembroke shook his head. It never had been. Sebastian's late father knew the truth. He also knew Eleanor had chosen not to enforce the full terms available to her, and that was where the revelation became more painful. For years, Eleanor had been entitled to demand far more from Blackwood. She never did. When repairs became urgent, she quietly paid portions through accounts Sebastian assumed belonged to family trustees. When tenants faced removal because of unpaid estate obligations, Eleanor intervened. When repayment dates arrived, she granted extensions. When creditors threatened the Ashcombe name, she helped keep them away. Everything Sebastian had accused her of trying to take from him had survived because she had been protecting it. He looked at her differently now, but before he could speak, another voice came from the doorway. Reginald had arrived. He entered with the confidence of a man expecting Eleanor to be gone. Then he saw Pembroke and stopped. Pembroke wasted no time. The forged request to purchase Blackwood's controlling debt had been traced through Reginald's financial agent. The authorization carrying Eleanor's name was false. So were several documents bearing Beatrice's signature. Reginald immediately denied everything. Then Arthur stepped forward. The boy pointed at him. He told his father about the unused study, the burned papers, the surviving envelope, and the warning Reginald had given him. Vivian added what she knew. Months before the scandal began, Reginald had already been asking whether she would consider Sebastian if his marriage ended. Beatrice finally understood the full cruelty of it. Her contempt for Eleanor had made Reginald's work easier. She had helped isolate the very woman protecting Blackwood. Reginald tried to turn the accusation back on Eleanor. He claimed she had manipulated the entire family because she wanted the mansion for herself. Pembroke answered with the simplest truth of the night. She did not need to manipulate anyone to obtain Blackwood. It was already hers. The evidence left Reginald nowhere to go. He was removed from the household pending formal legal proceedings. Only after the doors closed behind him did Sebastian finally face Eleanor. His anger was gone. What remained looked much worse. He asked why she had never told him. Eleanor's answer came quietly. She had wanted to know whether Sebastian would choose her when he believed she possessed nothing he needed. No title powerful enough to impress his mother, no fortune he knew about, no estate capable of rescuing his own. For 9 years, she had believed his love had given her that answer. Tonight, she said, he had given her another. Sebastian apologized, not as a lord, not as Blackwood's heir, as her husband. But Eleanor did not tell him everything was forgiven. Some wounds were too deep for a single apology. Instead, She looked toward Arthur, who was still standing near the staircase. Then she turned to the servants. Her voice remained calm. Her trunks were to be taken back upstairs. For a moment, no one moved. Then Eleanor added one final instruction. Lord Sebastian's belongings could be moved to the east guest wing. Sebastian said nothing. Eleanor was not sending him into the rain. She was not humiliating him before the household. She was simply refusing to be expelled from the home that had belonged to her all along. Reginald's downfall came quickly once the truth was exposed. The forged documents, the false instructions sent through his financial agent, the burned papers, and the signatures he had copied were enough to remove any doubt. He was stripped of every responsibility connected to Blackwood's affairs and turned over for formal prosecution. For the first time in years, the threat hanging over the estate had a name. But removing Reginald did not repair what he had broken. Beatrice understood that better than anyone. Several days later, she asked Eleanor to join her in the drawing room before the senior household staff. There, without excuses, she apologized. She admitted that her pride had made her cruel. She had judged Eleanor by title, wealth, and family connections, while ignoring the loyalty Eleanor had shown for years. Eleanor accepted the apology, but she did not pretend that 9 years of contempt could disappear because of one conversation. Respect, she told Beatrice, would have to be rebuilt through actions. Beatrice lowered her head and accepted that. Vivienne made a different choice. She prepared to leave Blackwood. Before departing, she asked Eleanor for one final private conversation. Vivienne admitted that there had been a time when she wanted Sebastian. Perhaps part of her had even imagined that if his marriage ended, the place beside him might become hers. But watching Eleanor humiliated in the entrance hall had changed something. Vivienne could no longer pretend that another woman's suffering was merely an opportunity. She would not build her happiness on Eleanor's disgrace. Then she left Blackwood voluntarily. Sebastian remained, but not in Eleanor's rooms. His belongings stayed in the east guest wing. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Eleanor did not forgive him simply because he regretted what he had done. And Sebastian, for once, did not demand that she move faster. Instead, he began repairing what he could. He opened every estate account. He worked with Pembroke to trace missing funds and restore proper records. The unjust rent increases imposed on struggling tenants were reversed. Money that had been shifted improperly was repaid. Repairs delayed for years were finally completed. But the hardest relationship to rebuild was not with Eleanor. It was with Arthur. For weeks, the boy answered his father only when necessary. Sebastian had ordered his mother from their home. Arthur had seen it. Children could forgive many things, but they did not forget easily. So Sebastian stopped demanding affection. He simply remained present. He helped Arthur with his riding lessons. He listened when the boy spoke. And when Arthur asked difficult questions, Sebastian no longer avoided them. One evening, as they walked through the estate grounds, Sebastian told his son something he wished he had understood years earlier. Being heir to a great house meant nothing if a man could not protect the people inside it. Arthur remembered those words. So did Eleanor. Gradually, the distance between husband and wife began to change. First, Eleanor allowed Sebastian to return to family dinners. Later, they began walking together through the gardens. Then came longer conversations. Not apologies repeated endlessly. Real conversations about pride, fear, money, trust, and all the secrets that had nearly destroyed them. Their marriage did not suddenly become perfect. That was never going to happen. But Sebastian finally understood that Eleanor's greatest secret had never been the deed to Blackwood Manor. It was the fact that she had possessed the power to take everything from his family and had repeatedly chosen not to. Months later, Sebastian's formal investiture as Duke finally took place. Blackwood Manor was filled once more with neighbors, officials, servants, and members of the family. But this time, there were no whispers hidden behind smiles. Eleanor stood beside Arthur as Sebastian was presented before the household. Then, before everyone gathered there, Sebastian did something Beatrice never expected. He acknowledged Eleanor publicly, not merely as his wife, but as the woman whose sacrifice had preserved Blackwood when his own pride had nearly destroyed it. Arthur watched his mother's face as the room fell silent. She did not smile triumphantly. She simply stood a little taller. Later, when the guests had gone, Arthur walked with Eleanor toward the front steps. He looked back at the enormous house and asked whether Blackwood would belong to him one day. Eleanor smiled. A house, she told him, belonged first to whoever protected the people inside it. If he learned that, everything else would follow. Arthur looked back once more. Months earlier, those same doors had stood open while his mother's trunks were carried outside. Now they stood open behind her for an entirely different reason. She was no longer being ordered to leave. She was choosing to stay, and perhaps that was the greatest difference of all. But what do you think? Was Eleanor right to hide the truth about Blackwood for so many years? Or should she have trusted Sebastian with it before their marriage reached the breaking point? And if you were Eleanor, after everything that happened, would you have forgiven him? Share your answer in the comments. And if you enjoy powerful stories of dukes, duchesses, hidden inheritances, betrayal, and second chances, subscribe and join us for the next unforgettable story from the world of royalty.